Hey everyone, welcome. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here for this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a deeply fascinating and, highly debated theological framework. We're looking at a text called The Case for Israel, and we're going to impartially unpack exactly how it connects ancient biblical covenants to modern Israeli sovereignty and land inheritance. Now, to be totally clear, my goal here isn't to tell you what to think. We're just going to lay out the author's specific worldview, step by step, right from the source material.
So, let's kick things off with a massive question that sits right at the heart of all this. Is a modern geopolitical conflict actually a centuries-old theological dispute? I mean, to most of us, today's headlines just look like standard debates over borders, international law, or political rights. But our source text, it completely rejects that surface-level reading. Instead, it argues that current events are literally the direct continuation of an ancient biblical narrative. To really grasp this perspective, we have to put on a purely theological lens.
Okay, here is our roadmap for today. First, the theological lens. Second, divine ownership and trust. Third, the irrevocable covenant. Fourth, translating theology to sovereignty. Fifth, accountability and self-defense. And finally, number 6, the call to clarity.
Let's jump into Section 1, the theological lens, framing the worldview.
Right out of the gate, the author identifies their stance as a Christian Zionist, but they're super quick to clarify what that actually means to them. To the author, this isn't just some modern political preference or a trendy geopolitical stance. It's a strict theological conviction based on a very plain reading of Scripture. So in this specific framework, the Jewish people returning to the land isn't seen as some historical fluke or a colonial project. It's viewed as the faithful, literal execution of a divine promise made to Abraham.
And this quote really shows you the stakes of that worldview. The author writes, "The war against Israel is not merely a conflict between nations. It is a spiritual and civilizational assault upon the very idea that God has the right to choose a people and a land." Wow. So, what does this mean? It means the author believes that opposition to Israel, whether it's from secular progressives, Islamist theologians, or populist isolationists, isn't just a political disagreement. In this view, it's fundamentally a theological transgression. It's a literal rebellion against God's sovereign right to make a choice.
Moving on to Section 2, divine ownership and trust. Who owns the land?
Okay, the cornerstone here is what the source calls the Leviticus principle. Basically, the biblical foundation for Israel's claim starts with divine ownership. The text argues that the land literally belongs to God. This isn't just a poetic metaphor, it's a theological claim with massive real-world implications. It means no human government, no empire, and no international body has ultimate authority over this land. Humans might govern it by permission, sure, but they don't own it by right. It's held as a divine trust.
To put that timeline into perspective, the source starts way back in the ancient era with the Abrahamic promise. Then there's a huge gap, about 2,000 years of historic exile. And finally, 1948 marks the return and modern statehood. The big takeaway from the text here is that, in this view, the covenant wasn't erased by 2 millennia of exile. The promise simply endured the whole time, waiting to be fulfilled in modern history.
Which brings us to Section 3, the irrevocable covenant, promises that cannot be broken.
Now, the text draws a really sharp contrast between two completely different theological views. On one side, you have the Abrahamic covenant, which the author firmly supports. This view says the original promises of land, people, and blessing are still completely active for ethnic Israel today, noting that these promises actually predate the laws given at Mount Sinai. On the flip side is something called replacement theology, which the author fiercely critiques. That's the idea that the Christian church has entirely replaced Israel, basically canceling out those original scriptural promises. The source argues that replacement theology creates a massive, unresolvable tension with the Bible itself.
To back this up, the author leans heavily on some New Testament imagery from Romans 11, specifically the olive tree. The text points out that the root of the tree supports the branches, not the other way around. So while Gentile believers are grafted in, the source insists the original root isn't just dug up and tossed aside. The original covenant people absolutely still matter, and God's calling to them remains active. It's kind of wild to think about how an ancient agricultural metaphor forms the core of a very modern geopolitical argument, right?
Let's pause on this quote, because it really hits the nail on the head for the author's defense. The covenant is irrevocable, not because Israel is flawless, but because God is faithful. This is a huge theme in our source. It fully acknowledges that modern Israel isn't perfect, because honestly, no nation is. But the argument is that divine faithfulness, not human perfection, is what permanently secures the inheritance of the land.
All right, Section 4, translating theology to sovereignty, from Scripture to statecraft. The author is incredibly adamant that this biblical inheritance isn't just some vague, warm spiritual feeling. Drawing from the book of Joshua, the text argues the covenant was always meant to be visible in physical space and real history. We're talking concrete land with real boundaries. And logically, if a people are going to inhabit a concrete land, they need survival and continuity, which requires modern political sovereignty. Basically, you can't have a physical inheritance without the physical means to secure it. But here is a really fascinating twist in the author's argument. The source doesn't treat inheriting the land as a blank check for unlimited power. In fact, the author writes, sovereignty is not self-glorification, it is stewardship under divine authority. So instead of ultimate freedom, sovereignty is actually presented as a heavy, divine burden. The people who receive the land are completely accountable to the giver for how they use and protect it.
That leads us right into Section 5, Accountability and Self-Defense, the obligations of inheritance.
The text lays out some very specific obligations that come with this divine inheritance. It's not just about taking the land. It's about what you do once you're there. These obligations include worshiping rightly, governing justly, preserving the people, and, this is absolutely crucial for modern geopolitics, resisting those who seek to erase them. The author argues that a biblical mandate actually demands that the people actively protect and physically steward the gift they were given.
Because of those heavy obligations, the author argues that defensive warfare has to be judged through a biblical lens. When a nation is defending itself against total annihilation, especially when facing asymmetric tactics like the deliberate use of human shields mentioned in the text, the source calls this covenantal realism. In this worldview, using force isn't a deviation from morality. It's literally a scriptural duty to resist evil and preserve life.
The author reinforces this with a really critical distinction. Israel's duty is not to be perfect. Its duty is to preserve life, resist evil, and remain accountable to God. This is exactly how the text pushes back against critics. It argues that accountability to God is the ultimate yardstick for Israel's defense, and that the baseline right to security comes directly from the covenant itself.
Finally, Section 6, the call to clarity, worldview consistency. The author gets noticeably frustrated here with how modern debates play out. They argue that moral realities have to be grounded in the character of God, not just manufactured by public consensus or whatever the current cultural fashion happens to be. The source heavily criticizes people who take heavy moral terms, like justice or proportionality or genocide, and detach them from their strict legal or biblical definitions. The author claims this just creates an atmosphere of emotional pressure and prejudice, rather than actual disciplined reasoning.
And the text ends with a very specific, contemporary warning. It points out a recent shift where some elements of the political right have started turning against Zionism. The author argues that this skepticism, which often hides behind the label of geopolitical realism, is actually a moral pathology. The source warns that this new rhetoric is often just recycling old suspicions and conspiracy theories about hidden influence, mimicking historical anti-Jewish tropes rather than offering genuine policy critique. And the author is calling on believers to firmly reject it.
So, we've reached the end of our explainer, and I want to leave you with a really provocative question to chew on. If modern conflicts are genuinely shaped by ancient covenants, do ancient texts still dictate the ultimate boundaries of modern statecraft? The source material we just unpacked gives a resounding yes, framing Israel's modern sovereignty as a direct, unbreakable continuation of biblical history. It is an immense amount of geopolitical weight, resting entirely on a deeply theological worldview. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this text. I hope unpacking it like this gave you some valuable clarity on how all these ideas connect. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.